Good afternoon. My guest today is Professor Mia Bay, my colleague in the History Department, and we're very pleased to have her with us. And I'd like to begin by asking you, Mia, about, I know what the students don't,
Okay.
What got you interested in history, and when did you come to Rutgers?
I came to Rutgers around 1992, I believe, and I got interested in history. I actually always liked history. I guess I got really interested as an undergraduate. I grew up mostly in Canada, but I studied a lot of American history in college and was interested in it because my family was from the United States.
And so you came here, and tell us about the things that you teach.
I've been here a long time, so I teach a variety of things. I teach African American History 1 and 2. I teach American Development to 1850. I teach American Thought to 1850. And most recently I've been teaching an undergraduate 100 level course called Race, Place, and Space in American History.
Okay, now I'm going to splice in eventually the jacket of a couple of your books.
Okay.
But why don't you just tell us briefly so we have a space to do that?
Okay. My focus as a scholar is on African American history, 19th and 20th century, and I've written several books. My first book was a book called The White Image and the Black Mind, which was on African American ideas about white people.
I loved it. That's why we hired you.
Yes.
I was the chair of the department.
And then I wrote a biography of Ida B. Wells called Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells. Most recently, I worked with Deborah Gray White, who's also in this department, and Professor Waldo Martin, who's at Berkeley, on a textbook on African American history called Freedom on My Mind, which contains both texts and documents. And I have a collection of Ida B. Wells's writings coming out in the fall, which is called To Tell the Truth Freely.
Great, and some of that addresses undergraduates, right? I mean, it could be
Absolutely.
used
Yes.
for that,
yeah, the
that
textbook
kind of purpose.
is for undergraduates, and I think the Wells will actually be very popular in
Good.
courses.
Okay, well, we're here today to talk about Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans in a week in which we're also looking at the burying of Pompeii in first century AD, so a very, very long time ago. But what links the two in the minds of Professor Weigert and myself, in this course we always do this linking of a deep past with something very contemporary, is the issue of how people respond to natural disaster.
Right.
So just give me very broadly your sense of the human beings who live in New Orleans, and isn't this a fun city and a great place to live, and very positive view of nature until a hurricane comes across.
Well, New Orleans is a fun city, a great place to live. It's been around for a long time, and it's very low. It's sort of a lot of it's under sea level, so flooding has been a problem in New Orleans in the past. But it's been around for a long time, so people don't really think about it. And
people are used to being flooded and under sea level.
Being
it's a beautiful
yeah,
city.
Yeah, and it's so it's not it's the Big Easy. So people, I guess it's like living in California, where you're kind of in an earthquake zone.
We talked about that actually with John Penfield on the Pompeii segment, and he said, "Well, nobody would today would live when they knew that there was a chance of seismic disaster." I said, "Really? What about all of California?"
All of California, yeah.
That's very interesting. So here in the Big Easy, people know about flooding, and that makes them more confident that nothing's going to get them.
It means that they've weathered some flooding before. I think in the 1927 flood that went through the Mississippi Delta, parts of New Orleans flooded, and they actually opened the levees on some neighborhoods to relieve to protect other neighborhoods.
But of course, that would have been people's great-grandparents,
right?
By then.
Yeah, no. So these memories and things don't
in
necessarily live on. Rather than, and I think prior to Hurricane Katrina, there had been previous hurricanes and fairly catastrophic sort of weather warnings, so people had become somewhat indifferent to them. The actual weather services were pretty clear that Katrina was going to be a really big one, and there were advisories going out, and there was an extensive plan for people to drive out that reversed the direction of the highways.
Tell us more about that, because I know that's one of the points that you make in an article that you wrote on the subject. Not everybody has a high-speed car.
Well, that was the problem when you look at the city's plans before the hurricane, and also leading up to actually the next hurricane, Hurricane Ivan, was that they focused on drivers. And literally the city's website, the advice to people who didn't have a car was like, go with someone who has a car. Find a friend who has a car. The problem is that a lot of people who aren't car owners are friends with other people who aren't car owners, since it's an artifact of poverty, certain neighborhoods, certain classes of people. So that did not end up being an option for a lot of people, which was terrible given that the municipal plan.
Talking about this issue of getting out of the city, and not everybody is equally able to get out of the city. And again, I want to just, because I know the students are going to see it, this is what was happening in Pompeii. I mean, 20 years earlier, lots and lots of ash coming out, and really nasty looking things, but because it didn't truly explode, there really wasn't a very good plan. So there was no sense that we need thousands of buses here. And
no,
where would they have taken
the city had an elaborate highway evacuation plan that actually worked perfectly. It reversed the flow of the traffic, allowing basically anyone who wanted to drive out to do so. But they did not have a plan for people who didn't have cars, and they actually didn't even have a plan that involved mobilizing city buses to take people who didn't have cars. So when the floods came, actually a lot of the city buses were flooded. There's a famous picture of flooded New Orleans buses that's called the Mayor Ray Mogan Memorial Motor Pool. So there's those kinds of consequences. They had moved the Coast Guards. Would be the Coast Guard. They had moved their harbor police boats away to save them from the storm, so they couldn't be used to go pick up people who were stuck immediately. In the aftermath of it, they've begun to incorporate plans that involve reaching out to Amtrak, to Greyhound or whatever, but at the time there was just no plan.
And remind me, I have this vision of all these people stuck in the stadium.
Well, yes, and then,
with no sanitary facilities, no food, no nothing.
Yeah, as the level of crisis became clear, the one plan that they did have was they used such buses as they had to take people to various checkpoints, and one of them was the stadium, which was, I guess, on high enough ground to be spared, so that's where a lot of people ended up being completely stuck.
Now, this is, for New Orleans, both a class and a race issue, really.
Hugely a race issue.
Poor black people.
I mean, that's what really struck people with the photographs coming out. It was the people who were stranded were 93% black.
Did planners know that?
I mean, it's amazing the extent to which they simply did not really think about the people who did not have cars. In fact, in the aftermath, when the city was getting a lot of criticism, some New Orleans officials talked about the people who were stuck as having not taken personal responsibility for themselves, which you seem to understand is owning a car and planning to drive away. So, the city did not take responsibility for people who did not own cars.
So this is different than, I often think when I hear about hurricane reports, these very stubborn people who will not leave their home no matter what. They think they're tougher. What is the Christie phrase, stronger than the storm? I
mean, there may have been a certain amount of that, but a lot of people were just in impossible situations. I mean, one example was a man that I've written about. He and his wife had 6 children and a nephew. They couldn't all fit in their car. The children were supposed to be in car seats, so they kind of delayed thinking, what are we going to do, because the news was actually saying that the police would stop people who drove cars that were unsafe. So if he drove out of there with 6 children,
right, automatically.
Yeah. So he delayed, and then he delayed too long, and just got stuck, and the whole family ended up on the top of their roof.
Now, we had people without cars. Do we also have people who are physically unable to move? I'm thinking of hospital care.
Yes, I mean the classes of people who got stuck were the old and the sick, and then the other thing is the race factor. But many hospitals were in kind of a crisis to get people out, and a lot of the people who are stuck in their houses, people who really don't respond to the evacuation warnings, are elderly people.
Now, can you talk to us a little bit about the city response? I'm thinking of the police, and the mayor got a bad rap on.
The mayor got a bad.
Well, right?
Yes, I mean that because the city's evacuation plans were so inadequate, he got a bad rap, and I guess his response during was not great. the the city police were not very effective, and some of what they did was sort of looking for looting and stuff. There wasn't a sort of immediate.
Were they the looters themselves, or the looking for looters? Tell me a little bit more about.
There was, some people who tried to flee on foot or sort of go ahead of the floodwaters would be stopped in like certain neighborhoods where they didn't want them to come in. I actually don't blame this on the New Orleans police. This is more in outlying areas. I'm actually not sure what the role of the New Orleans police is, because it seemed to be total chaos when the flood
my
came
recollection is that they collapsed as a force.
they collapsed. They kind of leave with everybody, as far as I can tell. So that it is kind of completely chaotic.
Now, is this particular to the culture of New Orleans, or to the culture of people who are impoverished?
I think that it's. Part of it is what happens when you have a disaster of a magnitude that people don't really anticipate, and perhaps should have anticipated. But as we say, the Mississippi flood of 1927 was really a long time ago, and there were sort of a series of disasters upon disasters. In the case of the Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't just the hurricane, it was the flooding of the Mississippi. And it could be anticipated by weather experts, but in some ways, people on the ground have their sense, as we saw in the case of Sandy. I've lived here for 50, 60 years, whatever, and there's a limit to how bad this is going to get. Now, this was compounded in the cases of the poor blacks in New Orleans because of their limited options. Think about it. If you were going to evacuate, you would have to have a place to go. In addition to a car, you'd have to have
some,
plans for a hotel room,
money
because if you didn't, you would be sort of choosing to go off and become homeless somewhere else on the possibility that you might get flooded, which is that's not a great set of options.
Right, and leave behind your possessions.
And leave behind all your possessions and not be sure that you're going to see them again. Yeah.
And in a situation where there isn't the kind of stability of doormen to make sure that nothing
exactly
gets stolen. Sure.
Exactly. So people just sort of did the best they could, but they didn't really have the resources to do a whole lot.
We have some film footage that the students are going to look at, which is very, very critical of the response of President Bush flying about overhead, and of FEMA generally, and which, quite frankly, makes it's inevitable, the conclusion that bad things are happening because these are not folks who count very much in a political electoral sense, or in other ways. That, they're poor and black, and it got too bad for them, and we're not going to do the kind of recovery and rescue that we would know the circumstances.
Well, there's that, but there's also just a story about political malfeasance. The head of FEMA was this Bush appointee who really had no experience with the kind of emergency procedures that would have been optimal at this time. FEMA was a badly run organization. They didn't really have a plan. They didn't have good evacuation plans, and they didn't have good rescue plans. The Dutch have a plan to rescue the whole country should it flood. FEMA should have been on top of this
much earlier. And if they weren't, in not being on top of this, they took a long time to mobilize such federal resources as they ultimately needed to get them down there and take care of people. I don't know whether it was Bush's indifference. I think it was widely perceived as indifference, or it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between indifference and incompetence. But there was certainly, I think, a bit of both. Where do you think this event resides? Will reside historically? In 100 years, it'll just be, about as well known as the flood of 1927, which I frankly didn't know about.
It could become one of those, but it also could become...
I think it has a lot more resonance.
Well, it also could be kind of one of those wake-up calls and turning points on a couple of different fronts. To the extent that it might be linked to climate change. As climate continues to change, people might look back and say, Katrina was one of the moments when we began to see the catastrophic effects of climate change. And to the extent that it is closely linked to transportation inequalities, I think it's also, I mean, it's just a moment where transportation inequalities become vivid, where you just see them on the ground. Who gets stuck in New Orleans? People without cars, predominantly black. And transportation inequalities, I think, are going to be a hot button issue in the coming years. We already, for instance, in our area have a lot of poor people who travel like an hour and a half to get to work, an hour and a half back. I mean, wealthy people do too, but it's different when you work every day outside of your home and have to travel for 3 hours, and you have children at home, children at home who don't have nannies. And as the housing prices continue to go up in areas like New York City, these kind of transportation issues where workers live so far from their jobs I think are going to become more and more important. And then there's also, and public transport is obviously not keeping up with the need of people who can't afford good transit. The priority continues to be on cars and drivers. I think this could potentially become a major political issue at some point.
I think another difference between 1927, which is just an example, and 2005, is the enormous change in the visibility of the situation. Our course is called Looking at 21st Century.
Right.
So, we're very interested in what seeing things matters. And isn't there an instantaneousness about, and a high visibility that simply didn't exist for any hurricane in 1927? The most you could have had is a still photo in a newspaper.
Exactly.
A day later.
I mean, that was what's so striking about Katrina, and pictures being worth 1,000 words. The sort of race differential about the people who get stuck.
You could see it.
You could just see it in that stadium. You could see thousands of black people, among the dead floating in the streets of New Orleans. You see it. So that kind of stuff becomes hard to hide at a moment like this. And you're right, in the Mississippi flood, there were some pictures. The most sort of scandalous stories came out about the Red Cross aid being administered on a segregated basis, and the fact that black men were drafted to fix the levees, basically on a slave labor basis. But no, it was much further removed.
How does that change your role as a historian? Should we be doing things with, say, a documentary, a film documentary is where we go, as opposed to you still are a writing crafts person?
I'm still a writing crafts person. I would encourage documentaries. I know that among the things that historians do on that level is there are historians and social planners working on transportation inequities and trying to sort of push on a policy level for a sort of right to equalizing some of certainly the distribution of federal funds that go towards supporting transportation generally, which go mostly towards roads, towards more forms of public transportation.
How do we get historians to do more than put a few pictures in their book? I criticize myself as much as you or anyone else.
I'm not sure.
In order to capture and convey, I mean, you worked, you were contributing in a collection of essays,
right,
which I think are very good for traditional people like us.
Well, I mean, I think that's a challenge, and I mean, I think if you look at the history of activism and the various roles that take place in activist movements that actually get things done, it's not necessarily about historians doing something different. Movements take a lot, including historical information. But I think one thing that historians have to do, especially around issues of our recent past in the United States, is to, in writing about things like the civil rights movement and so forth, we have to take it to the present day and deal with the ways in which things have not actually changed that much, or things have morphed into something different but continue certain kinds of racial inequality. So for instance, I'm currently writing a book that's on the history of segregated transportation that largely looks at Jim Crow, like colored only, seating at the back of the bus. But it will go up to the present and talk about the ways in which, in the aftermath of the desegregation of buses, trains, and so forth, we get this virtual resegregation as public transportation increasingly is not funded. Increasingly the expectation is that people will drive cars and most of the money goes towards highways.
Okay. I want to ask you to speculate on whether these natural disasters, Katrina, Sandy, there's the fear of global warming, are we moving into a period when basic attitudes about nature will become less positive, and nature is less nurturing?
Well, maybe we have.
You can correct me, and I deserve it if that's the case, but I think of the 19th century. We did a session on prisons, and why do you locate them all out in the rural areas? Not just to keep them away from people, but because somehow being close to nature would bring out the better qualities of people. And I feel sometimes that we're living in an age when nature is our enemy rather than our supportive and abundant.
I think we're living in a relatively small period of time when we've sort of, in many cases, grown so distant from nature that we don't have a proper respect for its dangers and its capriciousness. I think for most of human history, people have been somewhat awed and often somewhat scared by nature, and aware of its dangers, and have little sort of confidence that it will always be on their side. I mean, think of farmers, for instance. They always had to worry that their crops would be destroyed, and most people used to be farmers, right? But we have sort of lived in an era where we thought we had nature under control. And that was what was so shocking about Hurricane Sandy, for instance. New York City's been around for a long time, and that level of flooding has never happened previously, and people didn't think it could. But of course, nature has never been completely stable over the long course of human history, so we are somewhat delusional in thinking that it would be. I mean, even before global warming, we had an ice age. We have, so I think we're probably moving back to an age where we have to pay more attention to nature, even though we're no longer farmers and we're no longer paying attention to nature because we're worried about our crops. We probably actually have to take more we have to have more foresight and anticipate possibilities. And we've seen that in areas such as California, where they can't prevent earthquakes, but they can certainly build buildings that will withstand them better than they used to. There's a variety of, I don't know which of them have gone forward, but there's been a variety of discussions about how to better secure New York and New Jersey in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And that has got to become the new normal under global warming, where people try to anticipate the variety of old and possibly new things that might happen from weather. But the other thing, as I'm sure you're possibly aware, is that, people are natural disasters really natural, right? They often involve elements of the built environment, a set of assumptions, right?
Our great example, of course, is the Fukushima nuclear plant, but that is clearly that we built it ourselves and created a nuclear disaster all by ourselves. Whereas the path of a hurricane, at least appears to be more natural.
Yes, and that part is natural, but the question of whether the levees are built to withstand the kind of flooding that will result at a hurricane. In the case of New Orleans, they clearly weren't. The Army Corps engineers were aware there were problems with it. In the case of California, as I was mentioning, since it's an earthquake zone, are buildings up to code? So and then there's also nothing entirely natural about where people settle in certain places.
Well, that is certainly true. It just feels to me as if you think of the Philippines, fairly recent disastrous response. It's as if nobody learned anything from Katrina, and I'm not sure that the response to Hurricane Sandy was prescient.
No, I mean, I
think there's a lot more money involved.
There's a lot more money involved, but
in the reparations and in the repair.
Right. No, I mean, but also, I mean, oftentimes wealthier neighborhoods are on higher ground, poorer neighborhoods are in lower ground. So, I mean, there's nothing natural about who gets flooded in those circumstances, right?
No, that's very significant.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've had a very pleasant chat and a very informative one. And I think the students will have a number of things to discuss. We'll want them to consider the ways in which they live their own lives.
Right.
Indifferent to the force of nature. Or
Think
not.
twice about settling too close to the volcano.
Well, yeah, but
or too close to the water.
Also think that, but how can you think twice about not being poor if you're poor? I mean, that's
well, that's the challenge. Yeah.
I mean, that's really the underlying issue.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudy.